Hey everyone, so in this video we're going to walk through some problems that ask you to determine which type of statistical test to use for a given scenario. So watching this video and completing the following extra credit assignment should help you prepare for these types of questions on the upcoming midterm as well as for the rest of the quizzes throughout the quarter. Additionally, it's important to be able to apply the different tests we learned to scenarios you might run into in your current or future career. So let's go ahead and begin with this first problem. And so I'm going to present kind of three different strategies that I've thought of to solve these. So in the end, you could kind of choose which one you think would work best for you. So this first problem says that a researcher asks 100 random OSU students if they sleep for more than 8 hours per night or not. She would like to determine if the majority of OSU students typically sleep for more than 8 hours per night. So that's kind of our question of interest. After she collects her data, which statistical test is most appropriate? So I'll give you a couple seconds if you want to pause the video and try to solve this problem on your own. Then you can go ahead and do so, which I would recommend. Okay, so the first strategy I'm going to discuss is to just kind of put yourself in this researcher's shoes. So if you were to actually go and collect the data that she is collecting, what might you record? And so if I was making like almost an Excel type spreadsheet, I might have a column for just which student I'm recording. So student number 1, student number 2, all the way down to student number 100. And then it says that she is asking them if they sleep for more than 8 hours per night or not. So I might have another column called sleep, and maybe the first student does, and maybe also the second student does, but the third student does not. And so she goes through, and maybe the last student in her sample does. And so then from this, we could kind of see that she really only has this one column of data, sleep. And so that kind of tells us that, all right, that looks a lot like our one proportion z-test. And so because this sleep column is just yes or no, that's just categorical with two categories. And so we would end up using this one proportion z-test for this type of problem. So this next problem, now the researcher is interested in determining if OSU students sleep more than 8 hours per night on average. And so again, she's smart and takes a random sample of 100 OSU students. And now she's asking each student how many hours of sleep they typically get per night. So notice this kind of slight change where before she was asking just, do you sleep for more than 8 hours per night? And now she's asking how many hours they sleep each night. So you could go through and do this problem with that first strategy that we talked about. But maybe we can also think of a different way to try and determine which statistical test is now most appropriate. And so another thing you can do that we have practiced with all of our types of problems is just to write out what the null and alternative hypotheses are. And so you don't even really have to use the notation if you don't want to. You could also use words. And so for this particular problem, the alternative is usually her question of interest. So in this case, the alternative is that OSU students sleep for more than 8 hours on average. And so in statistical notation, it's kind of easier once we have the words there. We would just say that the mean is bigger than 8. And so now that we have that information, it's a little bit easier to see that this looks like the alternative hypothesis for just our one sample t-test. So that's what we would suggest this researcher use to end up analyzing this data. And so the final example we're going to go through is a slight variation on the previous 2 questions. So now we see that the researcher is sampling 50 female OSU students and 50 OSU male students. And she's again asking all of those people how many hours of sleep they typically get per night. So her question of interest then is she'd like to know if male OSU students tend to get more or less sleep on average than female OSU students do. And once again, we have to determine which statistical test that we have discussed would be most appropriate to analyze the data that she has collected. And so again, you can try to use either of the first 2 strategies where you could put yourself in the researcher's spot and kind of make a fake data set with what she would be recording. You can also try to write out the null and alternative hypotheses for this. Or you can go the more kind of analytical route, and these are often how the tests are introduced. So we can ask ourselves how many populations are there in this particular study. And so in this case, there are 2 populations, right? Because we have male OSU students, and then we also have female OSU students. And then also we need to determine if our variable of interest is quantitative or categorical. And so we see that she's getting how many hours of sleep they typically get per night. That's going to be a number, so that is quantitative. And so then based on this, with 2 populations and a quantitative variable of interest, we know that we should be using our 2 sample t-test. So you can feel free to try out any of those strategies. I personally like the first one the best, but that doesn't mean that it would be the best one for you to use. So maybe practice each of those on these 3 problems that we just went through. I've also included a couple of extra practice problems at the end for you to try out here. And so those are just for your own practice. You don't have to turn them in or anything like that. And then additionally, you can get a little more practice if you complete the attached extra credit assignment. And that's going to be under the week 5 module, and that'll be due Thursday, February 8th. Okay, so good luck studying for the midterm. Don't forget that that's next week and does require a proctor. And as always, definitely let me know if you have any questions at all.